Today, BRICS Plus and the fate of the US dollar. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, well, that is post covering finance and property news. Well, the 15th summit of BRICS countries just concluded in South Africa. The summit broke up with BRICS enlarging their membership roster. An enlarged group would represent about half of global output by 2040, double the share of the G7. That's a reversal from the turn of the century. But that said, there is still no clarity about what alternative institutions it plans to build, as a scheduled news briefing that might have helped clarify this was cancelled on Wednesday in order to give journalists some rest. But some of the US's top Middle Eastern allies, including the world's biggest oil exporter, are in fact moving closer into the orbit of China and Russia, further complicating geopolitics upended by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt are all set to join the BRICS grouping. They're likely to become members at the start of next year, along with Iran and Argentina. The move is part of a push by leaders of the BRICS nations, including Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, to increase the group's influence and to counter US power over the global economy and trade, including through the role of the US dollar. It also signals the determination of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Egypt to bolster their status as mid-sized powers while avoiding taking sides in a world increasingly split between Washington and Beijing. The UAE said the invitation reflects its keenness to champion the value of multilateralism. The Gulf states have been reasserting themselves more forcibly on the global stage, taking a more independent path that serves their interests first, said Bader Al-Saif, a professor at Kuwait University. Meantime, the US tried to play down the expansion of the BRICS, with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier this week saying Washington doesn't see this as a budding geopolitical rival. The history actually is interesting here, as BRIC was an acronym devised in 2001 by British economist Jim O'Neill, a former chief economist at Goldman Sachs. It was designed to pitch investments in selected high-growth countries, so it was not a power block at all. Now, at that time, China was going great guns after entry into the World Trade Organization. India's ascent was underway after a financial crisis a decade earlier. That led to an opening up, and Russian President Vladimir Putin was putting the economic collapse of the late 1990s behind him. Meantime, the US slipped into recession, followed by a sluggish recovery with confidence fragile after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And by the way, South Africa was added to the group later. But since then, BRICS has morphed, with some claiming it could be an alternative power block to the G7. And there has been much talk of a common currency shared by the BRICS nations as an alternative to the mighty US dollar. And some even been talking about backed by gold or backed by some digital currency. And there's also a new development bank, which so far has lent about $32.8 billion US dollars in 8 years. That's a tiny fraction of the amount the IMF and the World Bank have disbursed over the period. But it's a lender created by the Quintet as a potential counterweight to the IMF or World Bank as part of that journey by the Global South to minimise Western influence. Remembering that emerging markets chafe that an American gets to lead the World Bank and a European helms the IMF. The US is, of course, the biggest stakeholder in both, so it drives the economic doctrine. It was two global conflagrations and the destruction of European empires that gave the US its significant strategic position. And Western commentators, their basic assumptions about how the world works. But the West's strenuous Cold War with the Soviet Union and eventual triumph probably distracted them for too long from the bigger and more consequential event of the 20th century, which was decolonialization. Back in June, BNP Paribas SA said in a note that conditions were ripe for the dollar's dominance in global trade to diminish, even if the process was a slow, incremental burn. I want to buy from India. Why should I use dollars? Former Nigerian President Obasanjo told the gathering, to loud cheers from the audience. It's a payment and settlement system that will allow me to buy whatever I want to buy in India, whatever I want to buy in Brazil, without looking for dollars. But still, the greenback comprises just under 60% of global currency reserves, according to the IMF. That's down from around 70% in 2000, but still well above any other competitor. The euro is next with about 20%, followed by the yen, and the British pound, the yuan, has 2.6% of the total. In terms of trading, the dollar appears almost untouchable, accounting for one side of about 88% of all transactions in the 7.5 trillion a day foreign exchange market. And what the Fed does seems to matter globally. The idea of an institution dominated by Wall Street and the East Coast business elite met fierce resistance from heartland populists, as Roger Lowenstein wrote in his 2015 book America's Bank, which chronicled the creation of the Fed. Yet America needs a currency and an institution backing it that reflects the country's growing commercial heft. Until it came together in 1913 as a messy compromise, and even today differences arise between the district Fed banks and the Washington-based Board of Governors. But emerging market central bankers are often asked about their intentions in the context of what the Federal Reserve is doing, and they rightly insist that they don't have to simply follow the Fed lead, but actually their actions do reflect the broad trajectory of US rates, if not the precise timing. Now, the governor of the South African Reserve Bank has correctly identified management of any currency as a definitive issue, and some monetary authority somewhere would have to call the shots. There was a lot of horse trading about where the European Central Bank would be headquartered, who would lead it, and how it would be run. At the time, many leaders feared German dominance, but the bank was headquartered in Frankfurt, and a German has yet to run the ECB. 2 of its 4 presidents have been French. Challenges to the dollar's vital role in the world economic and financial system as often said to be, if not imminent, then over the horizon. For the BRICS, which don't share the European Union's sense of purpose in pursuing integration, the hurdles are actually pretty high. But will it be a no-show forever? As natural as the ECB and Euro look now, the path was far from smooth and only really got ahead of steam once the Berlin Wall came down and Germany reunited. So it is likely that the current noise about movements around a currency shared by Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa will amount to something sometime. If any of those were to be the foundation of a single unit of exchange, it would likely be China. Actually, 7 years after the International Monetary Fund added the yuan to its basket of reserve currencies, it accounts for a very minute share of the global cash. Paul O'Neill, a former US Treasury Secretary, said that if America ever dropped the strong dollar policy, he would hire a brass band at Yankee Stadium to mark the proclamation. To be sure, the current rebalancing of the West's geopolitical and economic power has been overdue for more than a century, even since Europe plunged into the first of its continental wars. But a generation of Western journalists and commentators are prone to overinterpret this basic historical dynamic. Perhaps, clickbait headlines aside, such initiatives say more about who's advancing them than the shortcomings of the greenback. Potshots that appeal to domestic audiences are no substitute for economic leadership. None of the pretenders actually appear remotely ready. Perhaps it is a distraction from difficulties faced by some of the 5. Russia, of course, is isolated from respectable quarters and is raising interest rates to stem the ruble's collapse, while simultaneously financing its war against Ukraine. China's economy is slackening after decades of meteoric growth. South African leaders are contending with their failure to live up to the early promise of the post-apartheid years. And South Africa, who hosted this week's summit, has done its best in recent days to hose down some of the speculation about foreign exchange singularity. That's a long way off, officials say. The talks will focus on issues including the establishment of a common payment system. South Africa's envoy to the group said last week, what is likely is the formation of a technical committee to start considering a potential joint currency. This takes some of the heat out of the notion of a plot to dethrone the dollar. According to a leading South African news website, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi refused to leave his aircraft on arrival in South Africa because the host, President Cyril Ramaphosa, wasn't at the airport to welcome him. And China's Xi Jinping explicitly failed to deliver a scheduled speech at an opening event where the other leaders spoke, including Russian President Vladimir Putin via video link. Putin, who didn't travel due to a fear of arrest for war crimes, unsurprisingly blamed the West for his war in Ukraine. Xi's speech decried a country unnamed but recognizable that is obsessed with maintaining its hegemony and obstructing China's rise. Much agitated talk, notably by President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil, of de-dollarization and an alternative BRICS currency actually came to very little. Indeed, the vision that BRICS countries, including its newest members, have in common probably amounts to very little too. It's about expediency more than anything else to increase their bargaining power in the trade, technology and military deals that they will continue to vigorously pursue with the US and Europe. India needs cheap manufactured goods from its strategic rival China, cut price oil from Russia, military hardware and technology transfers from the United States and Europe, and investments from the UAE. Accordingly, it cannot but have a foreign policy carefully hedged against binding commitments to this or that country or bloc in a multipolar world. Nor can it plausibly claim, while banning rice and sugar exports, to lead the global south. China's better credentials in this regard are also fading as it scrambles to contain a mounting economic crisis. Once liberated from commodity extractive and coercive trading relationships with Western nations, Asian, Latin American and African countries will always lightly regain some of their old wealth and power. The dollar was fated to lose some of its global potency, if not as precipitously as the pound sterling did after the two world wars, and large countries with industrious populations such as China, India and Indonesia could no longer be denied certain comparative advantages in the age of globalization. And meantime, China and the other BRICS countries have expressed a desire to buy energy in other currencies, but any move to transform the long-standing petrodollar system would be complicated. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE peg their currencies to the dollar, and they would need any other currency in which they were paid to rival the greenback in terms of liquidity and as a store of value. And as part of that, there would have to be greater demand for bonds issued in BRICS currencies, according to analysts at ING. Until then, they said, we suspect this will be a decade-long progression to a multipolar world. It would be a world in which perhaps the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi become the dominant currencies in the Americas, Europe, and Asia, respectively. Still, being part of the BRICS will offer Saudi Arabia and the UAE the opportunity and flexibility to rely less on the dollar if needed. Both have expressed concerns that the US's imposition of export controls, financial sanctions and oil price caps against Russia since it began its war in Ukraine could set a precedent. So the question becomes, will the bigger summit of BRICS, hosted by Putin in Russia next year, bring more to the BRICS party, or whatever it will be called by then? We shall see. But in the meantime, to my mind, the US dollar, at least in the short term, is going to reign supreme. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.